Well, it's really good to see you again. Haven't been able to get down here much the last few years, but you know, a lot of your faces do look familiar. And if I don't remember your name, don't take it personally. I may ask your name again, but after 50, memory's not quite the same as before. So, you know, as Tina was referring to, my parents were members here a long time. This is a place they were members here the longest, and so they have fond memories. My family had fond memories, and before my dad passed also, I know he remembered fondly his time here. And even after that, there was still a relationship, and I'm sure my family would say hi, Julie and my mother. So we do really appreciate you all, and you've been an encouragement over the years, not only to us, but to people in other places, I know, and in the foreign work. You know, you've meant a lot to us also in that sense. So, well, I'd like to, as the brother mentioned, talk mostly about Africa and some about some work in the Spanish-speaking world. I was overseas from the late 90s till 2016. Started working with a church, a Spanish-speaking church here in Alabama for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and then about 2.5. And then went in 2019 to be with my family and work more closely with my father. He was doing a lot of work in Africa. So I will mention him some to give some context about the work. When I went to Africa, I think in 2021, this last time was the third time. Second time was 2021, and had to cross from Paris down to South Africa. And it took 11 hours. And I thought, this is really an immense continent. You know, maybe 2 hours of that was over Europe, but about 9 hours over Africa. And last I checked, there's about 55 countries in Africa, a very large continent, larger for sure than South America even. And the population in Africa it's a center where there's a lot of people, a lot more growth than some parts of the world. So I've been impressed by how fertile Africa is, and I'll show you to give some context about, let's see here, yes. Mozambique is where we've worked the most. My father was going around to different countries in Africa. He maybe went to 5 or 6 different countries. But he met a man named Samson Mafuta, and that was really through Steve Wilshire and Ken Craig. I was asking Samson about that just this weekend, and it was in October of 2010 that they met and started, well, I think they met before that even. They started working in Mozambique. The first time my dad went there with him, with Samson, was working with him, there were like 60 conversions on that trip. And they just had a really good relationship, working relationship, and my dad was really impressed. Now, before that, he was in Russia, going to Russia for several years, as you probably know, from the mid-90s till maybe 2010 or 2012. And he was also working some with me in Latin America from 2002 onward. So, no, Russia and Spain, it's a lot different than Africa. Really hard to convert one person in Russia, but thankfully a few churches were established over the years working with the Russian preachers. And so we've appreciated how that's been able to take pass, and I think there's still some men over the years that have gone to Russia. But in 2010, my dad began to go, and you see here 10 provinces. I think he went to all but one. Maybe it's all of them, but all, if not all of them, all but one. And we have highlighted, let's see here. How can I highlight? Oh, yes. Morambala and Mopia. And these are districts in Zambezia, right there, Zambezia, which is a province of Mozambique. So you can see how extensive Mozambique is. From the capital is there in the south, Maputo, and up here in the north. So there are different dialects and languages, but the official language is Portuguese. Now, the ones I've been to are, places I've been to are Tete, Sofala, Manica, and on this last trip I went down to Maputo. Okay, and a lot of the work has been done in these central provinces and also in the south. That's where a lot of the work has been done. So I want to give some examples. I think a lot of these, maybe all of these slides are from 2020 on. And this was a trip that Samson made with somebody else. His wife also went. And you can see how the ladies, they're often they're on the floor on mats on one side, and the men on the other side. A bit different, no? And the women are with the children, or sometimes the children are sitting up front, which you'll get to see some. This is a lot of the focus here also was to teach some ladies, but there was teaching by Samson and other men there. This is one of the places where there's been so much growth. Hundreds of people converted in Morambala, another place called Mutarara. There's just been a lot of growth in that area of Zambezia. So that's just a few of the attendees to the classes. Now, I think these classes were a lot for mixed, for men and women. And then you see some examples of the children, lots of children that you can see in these places. And as I was mentioning, Portuguese, the official language of Mozambique. But oftentimes when you go to a church to preach there, they don't even speak in Portuguese. They may understand it, they may know to some degree, but their language, the language which they feel comfortable in, is often a dialect. So we often ask, or I think the normal practice is to ask, what language should we talk in? And so when an American goes there, they always have to have an interpreter for the languages that are spoken. And even some places you can teach in Portuguese, but it's often combined with interpretation into another language. So it's mentioned here that 15 other dialects are spoken. And oftentimes it depends on the district or really the province. Oftentimes there's a certain dialect spoken in all of that province. So now here you can see in the background all the books and the Bibles. These, in this case, in the province of Zambezia, Cheva is spoken quite widely. And Cheva is spoken a lot in Malawi, which is a country that's right by Zambezia. Oftentimes, Zambezia being close to Malawi, the country of Malawi, has given opportunities to teach also in Malawi. Now, so you've got these books here. Besides the Bibles, you have the books that are called The Story of the Bible. This is a project my father began many years ago to give all the narrative of the Bible in lessons. So they're lessons of one page. They might have another page of questions and teacher hints that can be used. So these books you see published are the story of the Bible, beginning in Genesis. So this whole series was a pretty wide project, a pretty ambitious project. But in each book of lessons, there are 48 lessons. And so a lot of emphasis, the first books usually given are about Genesis. And there's a section about the content of the Bible. They give a lot of generic information about the Bible. And then 36 lessons about Genesis. So that's book one, the contents of book one, which is usually the first book that's given out in these situations for new converts. So there you see they have to take the boxes of books, and this is possible because of the contributions usually of American brethren. So this man is preparing the Bibles and the books to be given out, distributed to the Christians. And the goal has been to give have one Bible for each family in a language they understand, and also a book of these lessons, of these Story of the Bible lessons. So often that way the family can study the book together, and whether they study among themselves as a family, or also the preacher or those who teach might use that same book to give lessons that they study together in the church. So here we have an example of a baptism. This is in Mospeya, which is in Zambezia. And remembering the instructions of Jesus in Matthew 28:18-20, when he talked about all authority had been given to him in heaven and on earth, to go to all nations preaching, and they would baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But sometimes that last part is not emphasized much in some quarters. I remember a man told me after he baptized some people, he said, this was in Latin America, well, I've done my work, I've done the work. But we understand in some ways, after a person is baptized, that's just the beginning, and that we also must teach what Jesus taught, continue to teach what Jesus and the apostles taught. Now, this man, I might mention him because Eduardo, I'm not sure we'll see another slide, many slides about him. He's a very active brother in the province of Manica. And Eduardo, he's really active in helping churches. And when he sees some kind of problem, they can often go to him for counsel. And he likes to send out reports. He gives a lot of information. So I've been really impressed with Eduardo and the work that he's doing. In fact, this weekend, they were going to baptize 6 more people. That's not every weekend, for sure. But this is a group that was started while I was there with another brother in December. And that group that was started in December, now there are more people that are going to be baptized today or yesterday. This is in Zambezia still. There's Samson. Now, his name is Samson, but he's not that big. You know, he's kind of short and, and doesn't look muscular. But as far as what he does, he does have a big effect. He's been a really crucial man there in the work in Mozambique. He also went quite a bit with my dad to Malawi. He's been to other countries, and he's from Zimbabwe. So it's really helpful because one of his primary languages is English. And now he's a really important go-between for a lot of people, and so we really appreciate how he works. He's a really active and effective worker, very good preacher. So here he's teaching the story of the Bible, teaching lessons from the story of the Bible. And oftentimes when it's done, lessons are taken from the story of the Bible and given it a place so they can have an idea of how a lesson can be presented. They can get more of an idea about the material. And then the local men that may use that same book, they may choose to use other material, but it's a basis for them. You know, one problem in Africa, and this happens to some degree in Latin American countries, but there's not as much material in Spanish as in English, but it's a lot more that way even in Africa, where you just don't have much material at all from brethren, and especially in their own language. So here you have a place called Zero. I don't know why this town is called Zero. Mompeya is like a district, which would be like a county here. And in these districts of Mompeya and Morambala, there's been so many conversions. In fact, back in October, Samson baptized quite a few more in Morambala, and he's trying to go there soon because there's a lot of new Christians there that need teaching. There aren't many prepared preachers of experience. So he's planning to go to these places soon, to Morambala. Part of the issue is it's not all at one place. He can't do all the teaching at one place because there's so many Christians. He needs to go to different places in that same district. So now, thankfully, there are Bibles also in the Sheva language, and they're able to get those Bibles in that language. And so it's always helpful when you can get Bibles in the person's language. Portuguese Bibles may be somewhat more common, and sometimes people that can't speak that much or don't speak that much in Portuguese can read a Bible in Portuguese. But when it's in their own first language, it's even, I think, probably better. Okay, now here's a class for women. This is Samson's wife, who's highlighted there in the background. And she really likes teaching women. She has a plan for this year to teach women, and it seems to have gone well in that aspect also. Well, always the first thing that's put forward is teaching the general congregation. There's also classes for men, but also sometimes there are opportunities to teach the women in these places. And when you have so many converts, it's really helpful to do that also, especially helpful, I should say. So here you have Eduardo and Otilia, Samson's wife, and those are some of the people at Mopeye. I'm not sure how to say it, to tell you the truth, that one. Well, I may be going a little fast, but I wanted to mention, before I go back into Africa, talk some about some Spanish-speaking countries. Just to give a little background about me, when I started preaching overseas, I did some preaching in Spanish-speaking churches here in the States, in Georgia and in Texas. But overseas, I went to Spain, first as an English teacher in 1990, and then in the late 90s, went back to Spain as a preacher. And so I'll talk some about that. While I was in Spain, after I'd been there about 3 years or so, there was a brother there from Venezuela, and he converted a couple of members of his family in Venezuela. He was living in Spain, and he was able to go to Venezuela. And then a whole family was converted that weren't his family, but about 11 more people. And this was in central Venezuela, about a couple hours from Caracas. Now, so I'd like to just mention a little bit, just a few slides about some recent work in Venezuela. One thing that happened in Barquisimeto, there was a very large church called a Church of Christ, but has other doctrines, and they divided. And there was opportunity to teach quite a few of them. They divided because of some issues with the preacher and things like that. But there was the opportunity to teach a lot of these people. And so you have a number of churches in the city of Barquisimeto, which was about the fourth largest city in Venezuela. And here's a get-together where they're getting to know each other, and had a Bible study at this get-together in Barquisimeto. Now, here's some people that accepted the sound doctrine. They were taught about some of the issues, and these are people that accepted that. This is a church in East Caracas. I lived in Caracas for about a year and a half. There was a brother from the town I first went to called Cagua, and we went to downtown Caracas and started a congregation there. We were just a block away from the presidential palace. I never saw Chavez, but we were pretty close there. And eventually a friend of mine started a church in East Caracas. So those are some of the members there. Now, this is just an example of a meeting place. Sometimes in Panama, Venezuela, different places, a hotel room is a good option to have when you might not want to pay the rent or not be able to buy a building. So this group has been meeting for several years in this hotel in downtown Barquisimeto. Antonio Lira is one of the preachers that's been around the longest, and now he's in eastern Venezuela. He's an example of somebody who, because of preacher support, could go to another part of Venezuela, and he went to the state where he was born and was able to start a work in a place called Maturin. My father was with him when he started. They were just the two of them giving lessons. Sometimes they would give lessons to each other, but eventually other people got interested, and now that church continues there in eastern Venezuela in the city of Maturin. Well, this is about benevolence. I want to mention that a little bit, just a mention of it. Back in 2019, Venezuela was having a very tough time. If you've read any about Venezuela, for a few years it had the worst inflation in the world. And especially the president who came after Chavez, since he's been in office, Maduro, it's been worse. Very high inflation, very low salaries, and so try to help with some basic things like food and medicines, our medical procedures. And Steve Wilshire, Ron Roark, and I were involved in that at the beginning of 2019. So I continue to do some of that when possible. This is a place called La Flor. This was some of the people that left the big church in Barquisimeto. You can see it's like some bleachers there. The man in the foreground is Orlando Vargas, and he's a radio announcer. He still is able to preach some on the radio, gives some shorter messages now, but he eventually became a preacher maybe 15, 20 years ago. And sometimes he's able to use his contacts on the radio. He's able to preach some on the radio to some degree. And he's been very active in helping some churches come to a knowledge of some of the issues and to take a stand on those issues. And that's one example here that I'm showing you. Now, there's Orlando with another brother named Luis Peroso, who sadly passed away last week. He had cancer for quite a long time. Luis Peroso is here. He's one of the older preachers, and he had got some contaminated medicine, and he passed away last week. But Orlando, he's been instrumental in teaching some about the issues. This is the brother Jesus, who works some with me. This is Luis's daughter. Back in 2017, I just went for a few days. It's been hard for me to go back into Venezuela because of the political problems and the danger. It's gotten somewhat better, I've heard, and I hope to go back someday. But I haven't been back in recent years. So the transportation there is not very good. Oftentimes buses can't get the parts they need. And so this is a brother who does have a vehicle and takes people around. They're like the brethren. This is in western Venezuela, an example of a baptism. Well, the father is doing the baptism. The son is reading the scripture there in Guanare. One thing that impressed me about Venezuela in contrast to Spain was how people are very open, quite open. And so that was an encouragement to me when I moved from Spain to Venezuela back in the late 90s. It was around the time my parents were here. So this is in South Maturin, and I just like the expression there of when that baptism was in 2020. Okay. Now, in Spain, most of what I'm showing you now is from 2022 to 2023. After many years, I was able to go back to Spain back in 2022, November. And so that was encouraging. What's happened in recent years in Spain, a lot of Latin Americans there. I don't know if I put this on automatic. But, and that's given opportunities to help start other works. So a work in Madrid and Valencia have been mostly because Latin Americans have started them. Valencia is the third largest city. Madrid's the largest city in Spain. And this is when I was there in November of 2022 in Valencia. I have a friend, Javier Alvarez, who preaches there. There we are, Javier and I. And now I'll mention about the Canary Islands. Let's see. Okay, the Canary Islands, 7 inhabited islands. That's where I live the longest in Spain. So let's see. Have I got it on automatic, maybe? Let's see, I'll try to. Spent the longest time. So there you see Tenerife. First I was an English teacher in the northern side of Tenerife. Then I was going on the weekends to the south where there was a group of people who were baptized. And when they first started, I was with them when I was an English teacher, but I lived up in the north. Now, I can give you this island here, Gran Canaria. There was a group of ladies right there who were meeting. Sadly, a brother didn't want to keep meeting in his home. And so these ladies, I don't know if I did something to make it automatic here, but these ladies are meeting on their own, just the 3 of them. 1 from Peru, 2 from Colombia, and we were there to encourage them. This is a church in Tenerife, the church where I went when they first started, back in the early 90s. And back in the early 90s. And after many, many years, I was able to be with them again. And we got to speak for them. These are brethren in southern Tenerife. The same brethren, actually. And one nice thing was one of the sisters there, she studied with a guy. He became a Christian, and now he's doing some preaching in this church. Now, it's really hard for a Spaniard. It's not easy to convert a Spaniard oftentimes, but she was able to convert him, and now he's a faithful Christian. This is in the southern part, just to give you an idea of the terrain. These were volcanic islands. There's some volcanoes still active to some degree, and that's just to give you an idea of the terrain in the Canary Islands. Okay, now, in the city where I used to live, we had a couple of classes, and the brother said he passed the invitations all out around the community, but, nobody really showed up because of that, but we encouraged the brethren and gave other people the opportunity to be there. This is in La Palma de Mallorca. If you've heard of Mallorca, it's an island to the east of Spain, and we were having a Bible class. There's a lot of young members, I say a lot, there's probably 8, 9 people there, and they're all basically young and from other countries. And thankfully, they're meeting there in La Palma de Mallorca. That's a typical Spanish alley in La Palma, which is not a small city. And in Spain, it's fairly modern compared to some other countries. This is in Badalona. Now, you can see the steel door. Oftentimes, businesses have a steel door. I don't know what I'm doing, if I'm doing something wrong there. But I have a steel door, And this church has been meeting there since before the 90s, actually. So that's the oldest congregation we know about in Spain. And that evening I got to preach in Barcelona, which is part of Barcelona. As I mentioned, we also went to Madrid. As I mentioned, Madrid, we also went there. We were there one Sunday, and Javier and I preached there that Sunday. This work was begun in 2020, and one of the brothers, he went to another church. It was called a Church of Christ, but they had other doctrines, and he tried to tell them, but eventually what happened was they decided to start another church in Madrid. Now, this is a home class in Garland, Texas. This was late 2020. I have a Peruvian friend there, and I thought it was interesting how many people were at that home class. This was on the way to Mexico. I had a meeting in Reynosa, Mexico, December of 2022, and a Panamanian preacher there who moved to Mexico because of his Mexican wife. So now I used to live on the border, so that there was a thing about that. And I got to see a lot of brethren I hadn't seen since 2002 in this place called Valle Hermoso. And that's a get-together there at the preacher's home. This is the preacher, Armando Ramirez. He really likes to translate materials from English to Spanish, does a lot of work in that, and was leaving from the Reynosa airport and was going to go back home to Colombia. When you think of Panama, people often think of the Panama Canal. I lived 9 years in Venezuela and about 7.5 or 8 years in Panama after Venezuela. So this mentions some about Panama very briefly. The downtown Panama City, a lot more skyscrapers than other places, hotels and apartments. Economy's gone a little bit down since the pandemic, but it's still, compared to most Latin American countries, pretty good economically relative to other countries. There's a meeting place. They have a meeting place just 2 blocks from the bay. This is a typical, well, I put this because it looks quite Panamanian. This was a church that we visited in central Panama, more towards Costa Rica, halfway up towards Costa Rica. Ecuador, I know Arlen knows people in Ecuador, knows of them, and I'll mention a little bit about Ecuador and Colombia. This is Ambato, which it's not as big as it looks in some ways. It may be 300,000 or so, but I like the view there. This is a brother named Miguel Quinatoa, Facundo. They can tell some stories about some persecution back in the late 70s, early 80s, and it mostly came from the Catholic Church. So they have some interesting stories to tell. Mountains. Ecuador has a lot of beautiful mountains, beautiful areas. Also, the churches around a city called Riobamba, they're up in the mountain areas. And sadly, they've gone down some because a lot of people have left because of the dangers that have come about in Ecuador. And that was evident on my last trip there. But it says here meets the Church of Christ. This was a Sunday service in Ambato where the Quinatoas live. They have 3 or 4 floors, and on the terrace, I should say, is where the church meets. This is Colombia, Medellin, the only church in that whole area, that whole state, which they call a department, that we know about in Medellin, is that one right there. This is a view of Medellin. It was the second largest city, may still be, for a couple of million or a few million. And this is just to give an idea. Sometimes what happens in Latin America, they build houses up on the hills and things like that. This is in Bogota. I'm sitting there with my girlfriend, and this is a Saturday evening service. So sometimes in Latin America, instead of Sunday evening, they'll meet on Saturday evening, because it's a day when people don't work in the afternoons at least. This is another church in Bogota, one of the larger churches also in San Antonio, and you can see they have a balcony. A brother who preached there, Nestor Bermudez, is preaching in Auburn, Alabama now, with a Spanish group there in Auburn. This is a couple of brethren who always are hospitable to me there in Bogota, and they're very active in the work. Henry and his wife, Sonia. Right now, they're about to go to the Atlantic coast and do preaching in churches along the coast. This is close to a city called Ibagué. It says here Ardo is closer to there. This is in the same department as Bogota, but it's out in the country. A man to the side of his house built this little annex for a church. This is what they call the coffee growing region, Risaralda, and the city is Santa Rosa de Cabal. And so we went to a few churches in that coffee growing region this time, which I hadn't been to before. Been to Colombia a number of times. There in the background, you can see kind of what a typical coffee house, a house in the coffee country is like. And they'll show a donkey and a man with a coffee on the donkey and a straw hat or whatever. And that's my girlfriend in the foreground there that, well, she's my fiance now. Her name is Kelly. So other plans. And then Saturday evening service in Honduras. Last November, I went to Honduras. And mostly they needed help with interpretation. So me and Jerry Falk and somebody else that went to help interpret because we visited several churches. They tried to visit all the churches in Honduras that they could. So we might have visited 10 churches in 10 days, something like that. Most of them on, 4 of them on Sunday. And there's a man from Virginia, Mark Beans, with Jerry Falk interpreting. And I did some lessons on my own, but mostly was interpreting there from English to Spanish. There's a church up in the mountains kind of in Honduras, and one of the brothers from America there. Some college-age students went also. I stayed a few more days, and the rest did. The rest went back to Florida and other places, New Jersey. But here with a church in San Pedro Sula, which is the most important city in Honduras, and that's on a Saturday, I believe. Okay, so I'll mention a little bit about Mozambique. I better go fast here. Central part of Mozambique. Everyday life, a lot of places on the side of the road to sell things. These are some of the taxis that are quite small. Obrigado means thank you in Portuguese. They had some animals there, the live rabbit, some to eat, I suppose. How they get water, they go to one place where they have a pump, and they pump into buckets and things like that. Chimoyo, this was on the last trip that we made in December. I went with another American brother named Charlie Norman, and this is what as often is done, because a building isn't always feasible, is to build a shelter. This is a recently done shelter for the church in Chimoyo, which is the capital of Manica province. This is a church building in Inchope, which is right along the highway, the main highway, and you can see some of the construction there of that church building. This is their type of outhouse for that same church building. This is in 7 de Abril, Manica province, which is where Samson works the most right now. Or he really goes to a lot of churches, but when he's home, he goes to this church. And he's had a number of baptisms lately. This is a back view of that same church. This is in Machipanda, which is right by the Zimbabwe border. And Samson's brother-in-law preaches there. And so there you see, it's pretty reduced. I think they're looking to get a different kind of structure to meet in because they've grown, thankfully. Justin, the preacher there, and his wife. This is real close, right on the border with Zimbabwe. This is one place we went for a Sunday service, getting ready before the service. This is that same place. We went to a couple places that Sunday morning. You can see the children. They get sitting down on a mat there. Usually see really good attention to the lessons. That one of those Sundays we went, and there were quite a few baptisms. The lunch, they often have rice and something called shema and meat, and they let us wash our hands right there. One of the Sundays, about before 8 in the morning, we went to take several people to be baptized. The first time I went to Mozambique, there were a lot of baptisms, and that's common there, thankfully. And Samson is a really good preacher, so that helps. he often encourages the people more after a man gives a sermon. And then here they're going to a place for baptisms. Now this was through Eduardo, mostly, and another preacher. And there's a place where they baptized that day. We had to go like half an hour away or more, and they had to rent a truck to get all the people there. And this is, there were 25 baptisms. That is the most I've seen. And so they had two guys. One person would come. They get the person down the water. Come on, next one. But they first took their confessions, in a group, all that would confess that Jesus Christ is the Lord or Son of God. And there's that group, the group of people who are baptized. And this is the same group that today, they're supposed to be, either today or yesterday, 6 more were going to be baptized. And they're starting a work in a different area with these people because they live in a different area. And that's already been begun, I think, from what I understand. But that day, they met with a church already established. And this is that first meeting they had after their baptism, the first time they took the Lord's Supper, which that was feasible that day. This is Eduardo, the man in front. This is in a place called Sagredo de Joal, which in English is John's Secret. One of the more impressive meeting places, although it may not look like it, but it's well constructed, and so I've always been impressed with the people there also because of how they dress, have nice clothes, relatively speaking. So there you see in the inside of the building, the benches. Church building in Beira. Beira is the second largest city, the second or third, and this is where a lot of work was done in the beginning. And you see the building that was done there also. That was through the help of American brethren. Dondo, we had a class outside. Gondola, where Eduardo works. I got that slide in there. Well, double slide, sorry about that. Some children there. And then this is another structure in Namatanda, also in Sofala province. This was during a weekday. So oftentimes these lessons are given in the morning or afternoon. And there we had to have 2 interpreters. That's not so unusual, where you interpret to one language and then to another language, so everyone can understand. Although the most common is into one language. This is some brethren at that John Secret's church. And when I say they're nicely dressed, they seem to be in agreement and dress kind of the same color. I don't know how they do that. But this was in Maputo. I went to the southern part of Mozambique, and we studied with men there for about 3 days, 2.5 to 3 days. Just to give an example of some cooking utensils there. And that was Sunday service in Maputo, which is the capital in the south. And I flew from there back home. I know Steve and my father, they would often take that flight, 15, 16 hours from Atlanta to South Africa, from what I recall. And I did that a couple of times, but they many more times. I know my father did that many times. This Greg, Samson, and Neves. Neves is a really active preacher in the south. And so there we were saying goodbye. You may have some questions. I didn't give us much time for questions, but if you have a question, or if later, feel free later also to come to me and talk. Something that you may have questions about, general questions, or yes. Uh-huh.
What's the most immediate need there in Mozambique, a lot of the churches?
Well, I could outline the needs as being, well, there's usually men that need preacher support. There's, because the work has grown so much, so, for example, a new church started, and they need a man to work with that church, because usually it's men from other places that have started the work. Bibles and Bible material, there's usually a need for that, because when a new church starts, they don't have anything usually as far as Bibles and material, When there's sometimes a famine or something, those are occasional needs in that sense, although the people in general are quite poor, but a lot of them are farmers, and so if there's a problem, a disaster or something, that affects, but that's only like more an occasional thing. And let's see, well, men that travel, to other regions. You know, they need help to travel, like Samson's going to Morambala to teach a lot of those new Christians. So that's basically the primary needs. And so we're really thankful how the work has grown and how it's multiplied, really. And some areas more than others, you know, and not so much in the cities, more in the country, in small towns. That's where a lot of the growth has been. So.
And what is the best way to provide Bibles for them in their language?
Well, usually there's a place they can buy Bibles. For example, if it's in Sheba, one language I mentioned there, they might go to Malawi, which is pretty close, and get Bibles there. And they are able to often buy Bibles there. The material, Samson, they have a place for copiers, printers, and they print the material there. But, you know, they need help with the supplies. So, you know, some things in these foreign countries can be cheaper, like sometimes food, but then other things are just as expensive. And some things like have to be bought in from South Africa if you're talking about car replacements, car parts, and things like that, you know. And a brother was going to buy a printer, needed it from South Africa, I think. So you may have other questions or comments. You know, it's just impressed on me what one person can do sometimes. And I'm not just talking about people like that have gone from the States, which has been so important, you know, people that have gone over there and seen the work and seen what's happening, and also people like you all that have supported the work, you know. So I just think in different ways, there are people that work behind the scenes, the preachers, and just in different ways, it's helped to spread the gospel. Because when they have the material, after they become Christians usually, and then to be able to go to the places and preach when there's an opportunity to preach in a place. And this is trying to carry out that commandment to go into all the world and preach to every creature, right? So, you know, Africa compared to Russia, of course, has a lot of places have needs that they don't have the same opportunity to hear Bible lessons. But it's just been impressive how fertile it is to me, you know. And so, any more questions you might have? And there's a challenge with being in different languages, you know. Some countries, you just have one language to deal with, and there you have several languages. And so that's something I'm trying to work on, hope to work on more, is getting the material into different languages, you know. So, yeah.